This tutorial explains how to use warp markers to give you information about where you are in a record and how to set up an outro loop so that the end of the record will keep playing until you're ready to fade it out. Warp markers are used to ensure that your record stays locked strictly in time for its entire duration. However, in addition to this, carefully thinking about where you place your warp markers can give you a lot of helpful information when you're mixing. If you position them at key points throughout the record, you can use them to highlight where set phrases start or where certain things you need to know about are. This information is useful so that you know when to start the next record or at which point to add other samples in. Have a look at your audio clips and move your warp markers so that they're in key positions, such as when the main beat drops, when the vocals come in, and when the chorus starts. You'll often be able to do this just by looking at the waveform. For example, I've already got some warp markers on this record here, but I'm going to readjust this one so that it coincides with the start of the breakdown at bar 33. If you look through the rest of the record, you can see that the warp markers mainly fall at the start and end of each breakdown section. As a general rule of thumb, this will divide your record into sections of 16 or 32 bars, and for many styles of music this will be sufficient. You can then use this information to know when to start the next record. For instance, often you'll want this to happen when the previous record is 32 bars away from the end. If you can clearly see when there are 32 bars left, then you know when to start the mix to get it spot on. In this example, that point is here on this marker. Not all records are this straightforward though. Some records have a key moment that you need to know the exact position of, so that you can time your mix correctly. This may be the point when the vocals kick in, or the bass line drops. For this moment, it's useful to come up with a clear way of highlighting this on the waveform. Let's look at this example. On this record, I want to show myself where the bass line drops. So I'm going to drop 3 markers in close succession so that I can easily spot when this happens. After listening to the record, I can see that when mixing, this would be the moment that I would want to fade out the previous record. I can now think about how long I would want the record to play for before it reaches this point. I think that a 16-bar intro would be sufficient, and so I'm going to set a warp marker 16 bars before the key point. And I'm going to move the record start marker to here. Now, when I come to mix this record, I know that I have exactly 16 bars in which to start fading it in, and then at the key point, I know that this is where the new record will take over. There may be times when you know where you want a marker placed, but you can't quite accurately see where to put it. In this example, I would like to place a marker here to show me where the breakdown begins. To get around this problem, I'm going to place a marker either side where I can see the right position. Then I'll double-click to place my key marker where I want it. Finally, I'll go back and remove the first 2 markers that I positioned, so that I'm just left with my marker exactly at the start of the breakdown. One of the most useful things you can do when preparing your records in live is to set up an outro loop at the end of the record. This does 2 things for you. It means that the music will never run out on you, so if you're slightly late mixing in the next record, you can relax knowing that the previous record won't finish before you've done your mix. Also, as you fade into the next record, it gives you the ability to leave some of the previous one playing in the background, ensuring a smoother transition. For example, sometimes when mixing from one record to the next, you'll notice that the bass of the new one doesn't have quite as much oomph as the record before. Using traditional decks, you'd have to hastily turn up the bass EQ as the first record finishes to compensate. However, if you leave the outro loop from the previous record in the background for much longer, you can create a smoother, more continuous mix. Let's go through how to set up an outro loop on this record here. Firstly, open up the sample display and ensure that the loop button is turned on. Then, in the clip view window, zoom out so you can see the entire record. Move the loop brace indicator towards the end of the record, and then zoom in to look for where to set up on the outro loop. Initially, I'll set the loop brace indicator to loop over a length of 8 bars, and then listen to how it sounds. What I'm looking for is a section of music that will smoothly loop after the main body of the tune has finished. This will often be a section with a steady drum beat, but not too many other sounds in the background. This loop seems to work quite well, although it is quite noticeable when the loop repeats. I will now experiment with moving the loop brace to different points in the record. That sounds much better. Outro loops can vary in length from 1 bar up to 16 or 32 bars. If possible, try to make your loop as long as you can to avoid it sounding too repetitive, but this does depend on the record. The most important thing to aim for is that it loops smoothly. It's also not necessary for the loop brace to always start on the first beat of the bar. As long as it's a whole number of bars, it should still loop cleanly. Once you're happy with your loop, zoom in on the start and end of the loop and set warp markers to ensure that the loop is perfectly in time. Now that I've set up my outro loop, let's do a mix and hear it in action. I'm now going to start this record and gradually fade it in. You can hear that the outro loop is repeating in the background. I think that I'll turn the mid and high frequencies down so that I'm just left with the bass supplementing the sound of the new record. I can now leave this playing for as long as I want. Before we finish, there's one last thing to think about if you use this technique. Keep an eye out for when the new record reaches a breakdown, because suddenly your outro loop might be left playing on its own, and it won't sound like it's meant to be there. This is the end of the section on navigating through your song and outro loops.